All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Let me switch my view here uh, and make sure I've got everything I need to get started. So, welcome. Today is, believe it or not, National Atheist Day, Thor willing. It's Dog Appreciation Month. Please don't tell my cat. It is International Fun at Work Day, which is what I get to have every time I host this series. And as you know, it is also April Fool's Day. Although, given recent events and the behavior of chronological adults, all the days seem a bit foolish, do they not? But this series is the antidote to that. And so I welcome you, one and all, to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. My name is Leanne Lord, and as I said, I am delighted to be your host. I am a stand up comedian and author, and also a co host for the Point of Inquiry podcast. If you are so inclined, you can find out more about me and my work at veryfunnylady.com. And I have a few reminders before we get started in earnest. The Center for Inquiry's Coronavirus Resource Center continues doing the work of fact checking misinformation and sharing reliable news sources at centerforinquiry.org/coronavirus. Some of the articles they've curated this week include a piece from The Atlantic about why people keep asking which vaccine you got. Spoiler alert, it's not necessarily because they're nosy, judgmental, and or elitist. There's a Washington Post piece that tackles the question, how long will the coronavirus vaccines protect you? And my favorite article, I know you're not supposed to play favorites, but my favorite article this go round is about how the CDC director has been warning Americans not to let our guard down. Yeah, no wonder she's got a feeling of, quote, impending doom. And for you Beatles fans, here comes the plug. As always, I invite you to subscribe to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. There are two ways to do that, digital and print. And bonus, the print subscription also gives you access to the digital version. And you can get either or both at skepticalinquirer.org. And that reminds me, please mark your calendar for our next Skeptical Inquirer Presents, which is on Thursday, April 15th. Jeff Hawkins, author of A Thousand Brains, will be with us talking about how your brain understands the world and why sometimes gets it wrong. Sometimes? I'm here to tell you, my brain gets it wrong a lot. Now, if you're new here, welcome. Here's the deal, the flow of the evening is easy. You keep doing what you're doing. I'll introduce our guest, they'll razzle and dazzle. And after that, we will open it up for your questions. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button, and that's the place for you to type your questions in the form of a question. And honestly, guys, if you miss any of the talk tonight, it is being recorded and it will be available tomorrow on skepticalinquirer.org. And so now off we go. Our guest tonight is a researcher at the Monash Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University in, wait for it, Australia. I think he is our furthest afield guest. His research focus is in understanding and countering misinformation about climate change with an emphasis on using critical thinking to build resilience. He founded Skeptical Science, which is a non for profit science organization, and that's organization with an S. So big doings. He co authored the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change and developed the smartphone game Cranky Uncle. It combines climate science, critical thinking, and cartoons to explain and counter climate misinformation. I downloaded it onto my phone, you guys. It's so easy, and I highly recommend it. Instead of playing solitaire on your phone, this would be a worthy use of your time. And so, with us tonight to explain how he's applied psychological and critical thinking research into inoculation using gamification and cartoons to overcome some of the psychological hurdles facing scientists and educators as they respond to the infodemic, a term we're very familiar with here. Please welcome tonight's guest, John Cook. And John, you have the con.
very much, Leanne. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invite. Wow, I think that's the best introduction to a presentation I've ever seen. So that was wonderful. So what I want to talk about today is, in general, how I use gamification to counter science misinformation. But along the way, I'm going to talk about a lot of the psychological and critical thinking research that I and others have done in order to counter misinformation. And every step along the way, all of this research is useful for you, whether you're using games, whether you're doing public engagement, whether you're a teacher, whether you're just having conversations with people. All of this is relevant and can be applied in many different ways. So I hope that you find all of it useful. But the journey that I went on landed me at the end to using games to build public resilience against misinformation. So I'll take you through that journey now. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was some of the research into how misinformation does damage, because you really need to understand that in order to understand how to counter it. What I'm going to start with is a study published in 2017 by Sander van der Linden. He's a scientist now based at Cambridge University. And he published a study with some of my colleagues at George Mason University and at Yale University. And what they did was they showed people different types of information about climate change to see how they reacted, what their response was. One of the messages was the 97% scientific consensus that humans are causing global warming. The other message was misinformation, casting doubt on the scientific consensus. And the misinformation was taken verbatim from a website, the Global Warming Petition Project. And this website featured 31,000 science graduates who had signed a statement saying that humans weren't disrupting climate. And the whole point of this website was to argue that we have 31,000 dissenting scientists, therefore there's no scientific consensus on climate change. This is what happened when people were shown either or both of these pieces of information. The group who were shown just the 97% consensus are represented in this first bar, in this bar chart. And what this shows is the change in climate perceptions, or specifically their perceived consensus. When they were asked what percentage of climate scientists do you think agree that humans are causing global warming, this shows the change in belief from before seeing the 97% consensus and after. So what we see is, quite simply, facts work. Like informing people that there is a scientific consensus strongly increased people's perceived consensus. And the flow-on effect from there was it also increased their acceptance that global warming was happening and human caused, and even increased their support for climate action. The second bar here was the group who were only shown the misinformation. And for this group, we see that misinformation has a significant negative effect. It reduced their perceived consensus, but also reduced their acceptance of the reality of climate change and decreased their support for climate action. But the third group is especially interesting. Usually in scientific studies, when the result is statistically insignificant, that's kind of a null result and not that interesting. Here's a case where a non-significant result is highly significant, because what we found, or what they found, was that when people are presented with the fact and the misinformation, the two cancel each other out. And what's happening here is a lot like in those old episodes of classic Star Trek, when Captain Kirk would get cloned and you would have the real Kirk and the fake Kirk. And Mr. Spock had to try to figure out, well, which is the real Kirk and which is the fake? That's the same conundrum that the public have when they have all these conflicting pieces of information floating around on the internet, on social media, in the mainstream media, and they're trying to figure out which is the real and which is the fake, what's accurate information and what's misinformation. And the danger is when people can't resolve that conflict, when they can't tell the difference, then the misinformation can cancel out the accurate information and basically prevent them from believing or being informed by the accurate information. And this has big consequences for anyone involved in science communication, scientists, educators, anyone really engaging with the public and trying to communicate facts to them, because it means that our facts, even if we communicate them well and clearly and get them out to a lot of people, all that good work can be cancelled out by misinformation. But it also points to the solution to misinformation. If the problem is that people can't resolve the conflict between fact and myth, then we need to give them the tools to be able to resolve that conflict. And to do that, there's a very useful branch of psychological research called Inoculation Theory. This is research going back to the 1950s, and it takes the idea of vaccination, but applies it to knowledge. Researchers have found through many experiments over decades that when you expose people to a weakened form of misinformation, that builds up their immunity so that when they encounter the actual misinformation, they're less likely to be misinformed. So it's really the equivalent of when we get vaccinated, we get exposed to a weakened form of a virus. So that builds up our immunity so that we don't get infected by the actual virus. The same principle applies to misinformation. So how do you deliver misinformation in a weakened form? In the experiment that I've been describing, what they did was for a fourth group, they showed them an inoculating message before showing them the misinformation. And this is an excerpt of the inoculating message. Basically, what it did was explain the different ways that the misinformation misleads. There were actually a number of ways that this misinformation was misleading, but particularly important was the fact that these 31,000 signatories of this petition were science graduates. They could have a degree in any field of science, and there were across many fields. There was computer scientists and engineers and medical scientists, veterinary scientists, but less than 0.1% of the signatories had the actual relevant expertise in climate science. So it was like 99.9% of scientists or science graduates, but with no expertise in climate change. What they found with the fourth group was when people were inoculated before being shown the misinformation, the inoculation mostly cancelled out the effect of the misinformation and allowed the facts to have a positive effect again. And so this research and other research into inoculation have found that explaining the techniques used to mislead people, whether it's rhetorical techniques or logical fallacies in misinformation, is effective in neutralizing the misinformation. And what I found in my research, I don't have time to show you in detail, but just quickly explaining it, I found that if I explain the rhetorical techniques in one area, like tobacco misinformation, that inoculated participants in another area, like climate misinformation, which used the same technique. So explaining the techniques of misinformation can inoculate people across different fields of science or different topics. And so that means that explaining the techniques of misinformation is critical to building a resilient public against misinformation. And I found a very useful framework for explaining misleading techniques is FLIC, the 5 techniques of science denial. This was originally developed by Mark Hufnagel. Then I thought of a catchy acronym to help people remember it. FLIC, standing for fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And FLIC is really just the tip of the iceberg. Over the years, I've been building a much more comprehensive taxonomy of different rhetorical techniques, logical fallacies, and traits of conspiratorial thinking. And even this isn't comprehensive. I'm still building it over time. But just seeing this big landscape of denial techniques, it really underscores the challenge in front of us. In order to build a resilient public, people need to internalize all of this. They need to be able to be aware of all the different techniques, and also be practiced enough or familiar enough with them that they can see those techniques in the wild as misinformation, comes across them. And that's a big challenge. And so over the last few years, I've really been thinking hard about the big challenges in now that we have this roadmap on how to make people more resilient, how do you actually practically implement that? And in particular, there are 3 challenges to this question of inoculating people against denial techniques that until very recently, I really had no answer to. And I kind of just stumbled upon the solution by accident. And these are the 3 challenges. Firstly, psychological. Critical thinking is hard. It's just psychologically and cognitively difficult and effortful for us to reason through difficult problems. It's not because we're stupid, that's just how our brains are built. And in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he talks about 2 types of thinking that people have. The first is fast thinking. It's also called System 1 thinking. And this is the vast bulk of our thinking. It's our instant, effortless reactions. We make snap decisions about everything all the time. And it's really most of what our thinking is. The second type of thinking is slow thinking. And that's slow reasoning through difficult problems like multiplication in our minds, or trying to identify fallacies in some misinformation. This is really hard to do. It's possible, but it's cognitively a lot of effort. And so this really psychological, structural aspect of our brains is a big hurdle for this problem of trying to build public resilience. But in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman also talks about a third type of thinking, which he calls expert heuristics. And this is experts who develop very quick responses to complicated problems, but they're only able to do that through practice, through years of experience. For example, a heart surgeon can look at a very complicated situation, in looking inside a person's body as they're operating, and make instant decisions because they've done that, for years, many, many times. And so what that is basically a slow thinking task, but they converted that to a fast thinking process just through practice. And that dynamic, that idea of expert heuristics led me to the idea of gamification being a potential solution to the problem of building public resilience against misinformation. And so for the last 2 years, I've been working on a critical thinking game that teaches people how to spot fallacies in misinformation. The game is called Cranky Uncle. It uses humor and cartoons as a way to bring people in so that it's not just a boring educational game, which would be hard to get people to play. Instead, the game takes a type of inoculation called active inoculation, which is where you inoculate people against denial techniques by actually getting them doing the denial techniques in the game. So in this game, Cranky Uncle is a mentor. He's teaching you how to become a science-denying Cranky Uncle yourself. And he does that by introducing to you all the different techniques of science denial. And so we see on the right screen here, Flick, basically, the 5 techniques of science denial. And so what we do in this game is we go through each technique of science denial, and Cranky Uncle explains each one We use analogies as a way of making the logic more concrete and accessible, as well as entertaining. And most importantly, we get players practicing critical thinking. So throughout the game, they are constantly shown examples of misinformation, and they have to spot which fallacy is in each example. And by doing that over and over and over again, they're practicing critical thinking and turning that effortful, slow thinking process, gradually converting that into a fast thinking expert heuristic, basically making critical thinking faster and easier. The second challenge in building a resilient public is structural. I can develop the perfect inoculating message, but generally the challenge I've had as someone doing public engagement is I tend to be preaching to the choir a lot. The people who follow me on Twitter, for instance, are people who are already engaged with the climate issue. They tend to be highly educated and really interested in critical thinking, and consequently the first early adopters of the game scored really high at the beginning, which was great from that point of view, but it was also a bit of a pain from a research point of view, because I couldn't really show much improvement with those early adopters. They were already maxed out in a sense. So this preaching to the choir challenge has been something that climate communicators have faced forever, really. How do we reach those communities that most need to hear these messages, whether it's about climate change or communities that are vulnerable to misinformation? And I kind of stumbled upon the answer to this challenge. As I was developing the game, I started talking about the concept to climate scientists who were also professors teaching classes at universities. And I was actually taken aback by how enthusiastic they were to use the game in their classes to teach critical thinking to their students. And I realized that educators are desperate. They're crying out for interactive, engaging resources to teach critical thinking to their students. And so once the game came out, the next priority was developing extra resources to help teachers use the game in their classrooms. So a little while ago, a month or two ago, I released a teacher's guide to Cranky Uncle, which explained all the science behind it, some of which I've already talked about in this presentation, but also provided a lot of suggested class activities based on how I learned that teachers were already creatively using the game in classrooms and adding extra critical thinking activities around it just to reinforce all the content in the game. So you can check out the teacher's guide. It's just freely available at the URL at the top of the screen here. And anyone who happens to be a teacher and is interested in using the game, you can sign up. Actually, it says preview, but the game's already available, so that's a little bit out of date. But you can sign up to use the game at this URL at the bottom of the screen. I mean, you can use the game as it is now anyway, but you can also sign up to get a group code and give that group code to your students. And then that makes it quicker for them to get into the game and more anonymous if you don't want the students to have to use emails to get into the game. And we launched this idea of teachers using the game about a month or two ago, and already finding an overwhelming response from teachers. So far, teachers from 27 states in the US, as well as other countries around the world, have signed up to use the game in their class. Haven't cracked the Dakotas or the Carolinas yet. And that's kind of vexing me a little bit. So I'm hoping that we can find some more teachers in some of those parts of the country. But what really encourages me here is, firstly, seeing teachers from red states just as much as blue states. So it's really, I think, reaching those siloed communities that are otherwise difficult to reach. Secondly, I was really surprised that teachers were signing up, not just at the university level or senior high school, but all the way down to middle school, down to grade 5 classes. And that exceeded my expectations. I was thinking this was mainly a university game, maybe senior high school, but it's working right down to grade 5 level. And I'm kind of curious just how effective the game is at lower ages. That's an unanswered question at this point. And we're collecting data, which we hope will answer that. And thirdly, the diversity of subjects that have signed up. Again, I thought this would mainly be environmental science and climate change type classes, but because we've broadened the scope of the game to be about science misinformation in general, or misinformation in general, and just looking at general fallacies and using examples across vaccination, COVID-19, flat earthism, conspiracy theories, and climate change, we're seeing teachers sign up across classes in English, geography, history, philosophy, psychology, physics, biology, as well as environmental science and climate change. Because critical thinking really is needed in every subject. And so being able to spot misinformation across topics is really important. The third challenge in building a resilient public against misinformation is social. For certain issues like climate change and also COVID-19, political affiliation is the biggest predictor of people's attitudes and beliefs about climate change. It's a highly polarized issue. And that means that it's challenging to communicate accurate climate information. And it's also challenging debunking climate misinformation because of that tribalness, that polarized sort of environment. And it is really social identity that drives that polarization. But it is possible to use social identity as a motive to build public resilience against misinformation. And games are the key to that. And this is something that we're actually going to begin doing next week. I was contacted by someone from Fairborn, Ohio, who runs an environmental group in her town. And she came up with the idea of her town challenging 4 nearby towns in Ohio to a cranky contest. And so what we set up for her was the idea of a cranky contest leaderboard where each of the different towns can all sign into the game using their own group code, and then we see who gets the most cranky points. And I think it begins next week, her contest going up till Earth Day in April 22. And then we'll see which of the 5 towns gets the most points, and then there's prizes and stuff, swag for the winners. But what this does is it taps into social identity and really that kind of deep primal tribal nature that is fundamental to human psychology. And rather than it motivating people to deny climate change and be more vulnerable to misinformation, we can actually use that human instinct to motivate people to build their public resilience. The further they get into the game, the greater their resilience against misinformation. And so hopefully we can continue, we're going to flesh this out and continue to use contests to build public resilience against misinformation. Lastly, I just wanted to share the URLs for anyone who wants to check out the game. It's freely available. You can download it on iPhone, Android, or just play it on your browser. And so I can also share these URLs in the chat window as well if people want to copy and paste them. And lastly, anyone want to get in touch with me, here's my contact details. Please feel free to email me or message me on Twitter. And you can check out more resources about my research and the game at crankyuncle.com. I think I might stop sharing my slides at this point and look forward to your questions.
Awesome, John. Thank you so much. I will let folks know that I actually I downloaded it. I went right to the App Store and it was there. and downloaded it. So not hard to do. And you actually answered one of the questions ahead of time in the chat. Someone wanted to know, let me see if I can get to that question, if they could indeed watch it or play on their browser. I sometimes forget that not everybody does everything on their phone. You know, some of us. I know that craziness, insanity. But thank you for that. All right, I've got several questions here that I want to get to. Um, someone Narav, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and they wanted to know, like, for the climate experiment, did the order of presenting fact and the misinformation matter? Like, did it matter if they presented fact first or misinformation first?
That is a really good question, and our experiment didn't look at that, but we have done other research afterwards. So I'm going to quickly type in a URL in here. I think it was fact versus human. No, fact.
I'm not sure they can see. I think that the chat is just for us, for you and I and the producer. Yeah, they won't see that, unfortunately.
So I published a study with Emily Braga, Sojung Kim, and Letitia Bode, 3 really great researchers. I was really happy to be able to work with them. What we tested was debunking misinformation and pre-bunking misinformation. So we show them the correction before the myth or after the myth. And we also tested 2 types of debunking. Debunking misinformation with facts or debunking misinformation with logic. So these are the 2 main types of debunking: fact-based or logic-based. Fact-based corrections show how the misinformation is wrong by explaining the science and the facts, whereas logic-based corrections show how the misinformation is wrong by explaining the rhetorical technique. And that's the main thing that I've been focused on in my work. So I hope that that's a clear thing. You've got fact-based or logic-based, and either pre-bunked or debunked, right? Either the correction becoming before or after the myth. What we found was the logic-based correction worked equally well whether it came before or after. So logic-based corrections, I think, are quite robust. They work, because we don't know what happens in the wild, whether people are going to see our facts or our corrections first or the misinformation. But with logic-based corrections, it doesn't matter. But with the fact-based correction, explaining the facts to people, it did matter. If people saw the fact first and then the myth, they cancelled each other out because the myth was the last thing they saw. And psychologists call this the recency effect. The most recent thing we see is often, more fresh in our memory and more of an influence. If people saw the myth first and then the fact was the last thing they saw, then the facts had a stronger effect. And so what this tells us is kind of similar to that experiment I showed earlier. Facts work, facts are good, but they are vulnerable when we put them out into the wild. And that kind of underscores the importance of coupling our facts with logic and critical thinking. Like an example being, you communicate a fact and you also communicate how that fact can be distorted. What are some rhetorical techniques that can be used to confuse people about the facts? And that doesn't necessarily need to be a negative thing. In the education research, there's a thing called misconception-based learning, which is teaching science by explaining how that science can be misunderstood. And that's actually one of the strongest ways of teaching science. It's more engaging, it achieves higher learning gains, and it sticks longer. So I think that kind of wrapping our facts in the bubble wrap of critical thinking can be a really positive way of teaching science.
Now that method of teaching, I'm not familiar with that, but I automatically, I'm engaged just hearing that, because it does on its face sound more engaging. Is that only on the college level though, or has that creeped down to high school and junior high? But I'm assuming you're talking mainly university.
That's a good question. Like off the top of my head, the the main experiments on it were done, I think, at the college level. But there probably is high school level stuff, but probably just because of the ease of having undergrad students that that's often where we do our research. They're just immediately available. It's also a lot easier to get ethics approval on students above 18.
Right.
I have to really jump through a lot of hoops, which I had to for using the critical game for research in middle and high school. However, I did some work with the National Centre for Science Education, who do a lot of work on fighting climate denial and creationism in classes. And we developed a high school curriculum using misconception-based learning as the approach. And it wasn't like a controlled experiment where one class did misconception-based learning and the other did standard learning, and we compared the two. But every classroom where we did do the misconception-based learning, we did see strong improvements in their climate perceptions, their knowledge, their attitudes about climate change. And what I was most interested in, their confidence to talk about climate change with their friends and family.
Very nice, very nice. And I also want to correct, I made a mistake in terms of what folks can see. If you do type something in the chat, if you put it, if you address it to both participants and panelists, participants will be able to see those links or whatever it is you want to share. So that was my mistake. But so you do have that option. Franklin Crownover wanted to know, how do we prevent inoculation against real information by disinformation spreaders? It seems that they're using inoculation techniques as well.
Yeah, I mean, they do. Like when I talk about all these communication techniques, I'm almost always asked, couldn't climate deniers use these techniques as well? And the answer is they do, and they tend to do it better than scientists. Like, I think scientists are mostly focused on doing science and less on science communication and engagement, whereas people focused on misinforming the public are mostly concentrating on misinforming the public. And a good example of this is some advice from Frank Luntz, who is a political strategist who was advising politicians on how to argue against climate policy. And he said, two things you got to do. Firstly, cast doubt on the scientific consensus. If you do that, it's game over. Because if the public think that climate scientists disagree on climate change, then they're not going to support climate action. So that was a very smart, while evil strategy. But secondly, he also advised, if you want to convince the public, say it over and over and over and over and over again until you're sick to death of saying it, and only then are people hearing it for the first time. And climate misinformation follows that rule faithfully. You see since the early 1990s to 2021, the same arguments being repeated over and over again. I'm certainly sick to death of hearing them, but the persistence in repeating these myths is, it's kind of extraordinary, really. And scientists, our instinct is we study something, we publish our result, and then we move on. We don't want to talk about that anymore because we're
done. Right.
And our headspace is always on the edge of knowledge. We get bored having to talk about stuff that is settled science. And that's good from a pushing forward scientific knowledge and progression, trying to expand our understanding. But from a communication point of view, we do need to be communicating those settled areas of science that the public are still confused about.
Right. It's settled for you. Everybody else is still catching on and catching up.
A good example of that, is in 2013, we published a study finding 97% agreement on climate change. The first journal we submitted it to, the reviewer was like, why are you even talking about? We all know there's a consensus. That's crazy. And so we had trouble getting it published, but when we finally did get it published, what surprised me was how surprised everyone in the public were. They were like, oh, wow, I realized it was so high. Now, even though 2 studies had already found 97% consensus prior to us, I was like, really? Yeah.
Yeah, no, the public is easily distracted. Um, so many other things to be doing. I like to take the McDonald's example. Everybody knows what McDonald's is, what it is, what's on the menu, and yet they see the need to advertise every day, multiple times a day. So if McDonald's, a well-known brand, is doing that, what more everyone else who wants to claim a piece of the public's attention? Um, Mike Rizzuti had quite a few comments and questions here in the chat and in the Q&A box, and this one struck me. I'm not sure if he meant to pose this as a question, but I will. He said that people who develop conspiracy theories, as opposed to those who simply just believe them, are slow thinkers. Do you agree with that? Like, there are people that are just they're building their conspiracy theory over time. They didn't just buy into it one night, going down the YouTube rabbit hole. Could they be considered slow thinkers?
I mean, yeah, it's a good question, really, because conspiracy theorists do think of themselves as critical thinkers, and they often frame their arguments through a critical thinking lens. So, it's often rhetorical language like, don't be a sheeple, don't be gullible, don't just believe the official account. And I think what that does is it confuses skepticism with, as in genuine scientific skepticism, with nihilistic skepticism, or in other words, denial. And so I think it's important to recognize the difference between skepticism and denial. A genuine skeptic considers the evidence first and then comes to a conclusion. A denier comes to a conclusion first and then denies any evidence that doesn't fit that conclusion. And so I've in the Flick taxonomy, we talk about the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. And again, I came up with an acronym to help remember them: CONSPIRE, CONSPIR, contradictory, overriding suspicion, nefarious intent, something must be wrong, persecuted victimhood, immunity to evidence, and reinterpreting randomness. And let me just pick one, for example, reinterpreting randomness. Humans are pattern detectors, all of us, to some extent. We're hardwired to detect patterns in randomness because in the past it's helped us survive. When we see some rustling in the bushes, is that just random rustling of the wind, or is it a predator about to jump out and eat us? If the humans who interpret it as a predator were more likely to survive and then I guess pass on their DNA to future generations, as opposed to the person who ignored the randomness. And that's kind of how our brain has evolved to be pattern detection. But conspiracy theorists take pattern detection to extremes. They will see 2 random things and join a causal link between them where there is no link. They'll see that the 5G network came out in 2019, COVID came out in 2019. Aha, 5G must have caused COVID-19. They'll see the virus started in Wuhan. There's a lab, like a disease lab in Wuhan. Aha, that the lab must have developed the virus and intentionally released it out into the public, even though there are viral labs investigating viruses all throughout the world. And so that pattern detection could be perceived as slow thinking or critical thinking, but it isn't really. It's actually more of a fast thinking kind of mental shortcut or heuristic, just seeing links between things. And we often, this is another thing, like we think of ourselves as scientists, right? Where we're investigating and coming to conclusions, but we're more like lawyers. We come to our conclusions and then we justify or rationalize them. And often what we think is slow thinking is more make that pattern detection link and then try to
Yes.
rationalize it
Oh,
as
yeah.
well. So it can be possible to confuse fast thinking to be actually slow thinking.
Yeah. And as I was listening to you, I actually made the note that particularly here in the States, we don't seem to value or reward slow thinking. Social media doesn't. You know, you've got to have that quick response on Twitter or Instagram or you know, with your friends or on television. And you know, the idea that you go, no, I don't know, I want to think about this. You know, that's a clutch the pearls moment in our society that rewards, you know, fast thinking over slow. Um, but yeah, no, thank you for that answer. Um, William London wanted to know: are there any plans to have non-white looking versions of the Cranky Uncle? It might make the game more appealing for audiences like his students or across the board. Maybe that's an option in a future version. You may not have plans for that, but has that been suggested before?
Yeah, we've definitely been thinking about it and thinking through how we could practically implement it. As soon as the game came out, people started asking us, or really volunteering to help translate the game into different languages. And we do have like up to a dozen languages now kind of in the pipeline ready to like for volunteers to start translating it. So the next step in the game is to create a multilingual version where we can have like teams of volunteers translating it into different languages. Most of the languages currently are in Europe. It's like French, German, Czechoslovakian. But even just yesterday, I had a really interesting conversation with someone who works on misinformation in mostly African countries and a bit Middle Eastern. And he talked about how to just doing a simple language translation isn't sufficient in those contexts. You need to also make it both culturally relevant and country specific. It might be the same language across different countries, but you know, you would need to use different examples in different countries in order for it to resonate. Like right now, it's a very US centric kind of thing. I'm talking about JFK conspiracy theories and Roswell or something, you know, things that I'm really kind of reflecting the strong US bias in the climate misinformation research community. And so what we are hoping to do down the track is build partnerships with teams in different parts of the world who can help not only translate the content, but make it more relevant locally. And also the images, all the cartoons of Cranky Uncle are very switchable. Like the way it's set up, we could easily have a different character or different cartoons, different graphics in there. And so, yeah, so the answer to the question is yes, we're definitely interested in doing that. And it's just a matter of figuring it out. It's complicated, but I'm sure we can figure it out over time.
Yeah, for sure. It can grow into being something bigger than you even thought. We always, let's see, I lost this question. I think I scrolled past it. Um, but we all get it's, oh, there we go. Terry Anderson. Thank you, Terry. It seems that somebody always asks a version of this in all of the presentations that we've had. And so I'll continue to ask it to just get your perception or your answer. And Terry wants to know: is there any way that I can kindly influence my relative who believes in conspiracy theories? Terry downloaded the app and is excited about it, but doesn't believe the relative would. So how do you rescue the people that you know and still love?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I get that question pretty much every time as well. And the first thing I would say is that from a communication point of view, I really see two kind of main audiences. There is the cranky uncles, or as in the literature, I guess you would call them dismissives, people who are dismissive about science or climate science. And then, well, three groups really. Then there's the undecided or disengaged, and then there's the engaged. And so there's really two goals. One is inoculating the 90% of the population who aren't dismissive of science, so that they're at least resilient against being misinformed by misinformation. And then there's the 10% who are dismissive, changing their minds to be more accepting of science. And so those are two very different groups and two very different goals. I think that if for anyone who has limited resources, you get a lot more, I think, productive outcomes concentrating on people who are at least open to science, that 90% of the population. And that's where I focus my efforts. And that's kind of the implied truth of inoculation, which is it's about stopping misinformation from spreading rather than trying to kind of cure or change people's minds. That said, we all have family members and friends who are dismissive, and we want to know how we can talk to them. So recognizing that it is really difficult to change a person's mind who is dismissive or conspiratorial because of that suspicion, any information you give them will, like one of those 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking is immunity to evidence. They reinterpret any evidence disproving the conspiracy as coming from the conspiracy. Oh, so, you say, well, that conspiracy theory can't be true because of this. They'll say, well, that information was created by the conspirators, so just to hide their tracks. It's really hard to change a person's mind in that mindset. That said, I think go into those kind of conversations with expectations low because of that dynamic. But the strategies I recommend are empathy, creativity, and focusing on shared common values. Right? So definitely empathy rather than ridicule.
Okay.
Did I say creativity or curiosity? I meant to say curiosity, as in,
okay.
I think empathy and curiosity is a way of encouraging them to elicit or like explain why they believe what they believe, and then appealing to the shared common value of critical thinking. Because conspiracy theorists think of themselves as critical thinkers, encourage them to apply that critical thinking to their own conspiracy theories. But the last thing I would say is be patient. I had years of conversations about climate change with my dad, and I would get quite frustrated, and it was kind of like banging my head against a brick wall. But after many years, then it seemed like overnight suddenly changed his mind about climate change, and wow. And so sometimes it can be just, maintaining a relationship. Don't burn those bridges. Be patient, be empathetic, and just hang in there.
Yeah. Now, I've seen people way better than me. I'd like to think of myself as compassionate, but I've seen people way better than me than using curiosity as a tool. Like, what do you mean by that? Can you explain that? Where'd you get that? Like, and giving them the opportunity to talk and then engage, as long as we're not completely off the rails, we're actually still talking. Once the yelling starts, then we're done. But yeah, no, I think those are good tools to start with. And I want to follow up with just a few more questions. I think this is relevant as well. Dick Humphrey says, what are the best ways to find facts? You would think in the wild world of the internet, they're easy, but some of these sites are slick. Are there anti-denial sites to go to? Those that present misinformation are often very convincing, lifting theories and pseudo facts from denial sites. It's frustrating trying to find in a timely way responses to arguments that are false. So is there something that you can recommend there? Like, what are the best ways for people to inform themselves so they're not being taken in and they can then have real engaging factual conversations with people?
I mean, at the risk of being self-serving, I would recommend skepticalscience.com as a good source of.
I hoped you would.
And the point of skeptical science, the approach from day one was debunking climate misinformation with peer-reviewed science. And whenever possible, we would link to the primary sources, the original research, trying to find always non-paywall, open versions of the research. So, and scapular science was always about making all that peer-reviewed science more accessible to the public, explaining it, and so just providing authoritative responses to all the most common myths about climate change. But now, and that's really the fact-based approach that I was talking about. In the last half decade, I've kind of been shifting my focus to the logic-based approach or the critical thinking-based approach. And so that's where crankyuncle.com is fleshing out that research and digging deeper into the fallacies, the rhetorical techniques, and how helping people to spot them.
I think I mentioned this to you. This was offline when we first met yesterday, that I had taken the opportunity, in my research and learning about you, I came across one of your videos on YouTube that I highly recommend to people. Yes, please go back and watch this talk if you've missed anything, but I do recommend the YouTube video that you produced, 23 Ways to Mislead. And it's you watch it at your leisure. And I recommend watching, even pausing, taking in that technique, because it along with Cranky Uncle and what you've done here, it really helps people just sort of, when you start thinking better, and recognizing things, you then can lead others in that way, but in the compassionate way that you spoke of. Wallace Garthright says, it looks like your game avoids the whack-a-mole thing. Is that true? It's not just a whack-a-mole type game. Oh, do you
So I guess by whack-a-mole, so by whack-a-mole, do you mean like just trying to hit each myth individually?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point. The fact-based approach is kind of the whack-a-mole approach.
Okay.
Whereas the logic-based approach is more like a universal vaccine against misinformation. And once you know how to spot a false dichotomy or a red herring or a fake expert, you can see that across any topic. So yes, that is one of the ways that the critical thinking-based approach is more powerful than fact-based. That said, I'm not dissing facts. Like, I'm all about facts, and ideally facts and logic together. But yeah, I think in most responses to misinformation, in most of the research about misinformation, it's predominantly fact-based approaches, and so logic-based it's almost, I hesitate to say the new kid on town, because Socrates was pushing this thousands of years ago, but in the misinformation research and most fact-checking sites, like it's in the heading, right? There needs to be more logic-based incorporated in. Like, I've recently done some collaborating with both Facebook and NASA on debunking climate misinformation. And in both cases, the instinct with these institutions is to just confine it to communicating facts. And I've been working with them to try to incorporate the logic, critical thinking aspects into their debunkings as well.
Okay. Based on that, this might be one of our last two questions here. Nancy, and I'm not going to try to mangle your last name, Nancy D. Oh no, I'm sorry, not Nancy. Yazar Webby wants to know where they can find this research on the effectiveness of teaching about how science can be misunderstood. We were both intrigued by that. Can you point them in a direction?
I would suggest, like, every paper I've ever published, and usually linking to the actual paper, is at sks.to/John Cook. So all the studies I've talked about here, as well as a few other research into misinformation, can be found there. So I'm not quite sure how to type it, because this is the webinar setup is different to the usual Zoom meeting setup, but yeah, sks.to/John Cook gives you a wealth of extra resources to follow up on.
Oh, my producer, I believe my producer just dropped the link for everybody so they can get more follow up with you about that information.
Thank you.
But we are, and Nancy, I feel bad. I thought I was going to ask your question before, but it was really the other one. But I don't want to leave you hanging. I will give you the last question. And this is a good one. This is a hard one. How do you debunk an authority figure who spouts misinformation? I believe we had a 4-year battle with that in this country. So, yeah, that's going to be easy to answer, right?
I mean, yeah, well, if it's an authority figure who doesn't have expertise, that's one matter. And that is challenging. Like if it's a political leader, that is really hard because like in the case of climate change, the biggest driver of people's attitudes about climate change is what political leaders are saying. Like when a lot of political leaders are casting doubt on climate science, that has an effect on people's attitudes. So that's definitely a big problem. But it's even more problematic if it's a climate scientist who's also in denial of climate change, and is promoting misinformation, but they have genuine expertise. Like I talked about, there was 97% consensus amongst climate scientists, but that does mean that 3% of climate scientists disagree with human-caused global warming, and those 3% tend to get magnified in the media. They get these megaphones to be able to misinform the public. So the question is like, what do you do in those cases? And I was asked this the other day, and it is difficult because often they will publish like papers or articles that are very technical, and it requires a high-level expert to spend days sorting through, all the calculations or the modeling that they do in order to identify where there might be a mistake, and that's not an easy thing. And how the general public understand that is even harder. I think the general answer to this, though, is communicating to people the weight of evidence or the weight of experts. Where is the scientific community at? If there is a contrarian scientist expressing one view, it's important to put that in the broader perspective of often the media will portray a climate debate as a contrarian scientist versus a climate scientist, like a mainstream climate scientist, and the public are left thinking there's a 50-50 debate. And that actually reduces public perceptions of consensus and ends up misinforming them. So I think that it's important for the public to understand that these contrarian scientists, put them in the broader context, that they are like 3% amongst 97%, the 97% consensus. There's a really hilarious John Oliver video that kind of communicates this. So if you just get on the YouTube and search for John Oliver climate debate, he proposes one kind of solution to the problem, which is pretty hilarious.
I love it. I love it. Sometimes humor can help deliver a message. I'm a big fan of that, given my job. But John, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. And I want to remind the audience that if you missed any of this, the recording will be available tomorrow at skepticalinquirer.org. Our next guest in the series will be here on Thursday, April 15th. Jeff Hawkins, the author of 1,000 Brains, will be with us talking about how your brain understands the world and why it sometimes gets it wrong. So again, my thanks to you, John, and to Skeptical Inquirer, CFI, our producer tonight, Mark Kreigler, and to you, the audience, for your time and attention. My name is Leanne Lord. Thank you and good night. Hi, John.
Thanks a lot.